This is a Vivekananda Kendra Kanyakumari recording. All recordings of Vivekananda Kendra are in the public domain. For more information and also to volunteer, please visit www.vkendra.org. My India, the India Eternal by Swami Vivekananda. Read by Noyana Chatterjee. Chapter 9. The Torchbearers.
The two ideals of truth, Shruti and Smriti. Two ideals of truth are in our scriptures. The one is that we call the eternal, and the other is not so authoritative, yet binding under particular circumstances, times, and places. The eternal relations which deal with the nature of the soul and of God, and the relations between souls and gods are embodied in what we call the Shrutis, the Vedas. The next set of truth is that we call the Smritis, as embodied in the words of Manu, Yajnavalkya and other writers, and also in the Puranas down to the Tantras. The second class of books and teachings is subordinate to the Shrutis, inasmuch as whenever any one of these contradicts anything in the Shrutis must prevail. This is the law. The idea is that the framework of the destiny and goal of man has been all delineated in the Veda. The details have been left to be worked out in the Smritis and Puranas. As for general direction, the Shrutis are enough. For spiritual life, nothing more can be said. Nothing more can be known. All that is necessary has been known. All the advice that is necessary to lead the soul to perfection has been completed in the Shrutis. The details alone were left out, and these the Smritis have supplied from time to time. Another peculiarity is that these Shrutis have many sages as the recorders of the truths in them, mostly men, even some women. Very little is known of their personalities, the dates of their birth and so forth, but their best thoughts, their best discoveries, I should say, are preserved there, embodied in the sacred literature of our country, the Vedas. In the Smritis, on the other hand, personalities are more in evidence, startling, gigantic, impressive, world-moving persons stand before us, as it were, for the first time, sometimes of more magnitude even than their teachings. But the very fountainhead of our religion is in the Shrutis, the Vedas, which are perfectly impersonal. The persons all come in the Smritis and the Puranas, the great avatars, incarnations of God, prophets, and so forth. Who are the Rishis? The mass of knowledge called the Vedanta was discovered by personages called Rishis, and the Rishi is defined as a mantra drashta, a seer of thought, not that the thought was his own. Whenever you hear that a certain passage of the Vedas came from a certain Rishi, never think that he wrote it or created it out of his mind. He was the seer of the thought which already existed. It existed in the universe eternally. This sage was the discoverer. The Rishis were spiritual discoverers. Who are the Rishis? The Rishi, as he is called in the Upanishad, is not an ordinary man, but a mantra drashta. He is a man who sees religion, to whom religion is not merely book learning, not argumentation, nor speculation, nor much talking, but actual realization, a coming face to face with truths which transcend the senses. This is Rishihood. Consciousness is bound by the senses. Beyond that, beyond the senses, men must go in order to arrive at the truths of the spiritual world. And there are even now persons who succeed in going beyond the bounds of the senses. These are called Rishis, because they come face to face with spiritual truths. The proof, therefore, of the Veda is just the same as the proof of this table before me. Pratyaksha, direct perception. This I see with the senses and the truths of spirituality. We also see in a superconscious state of the human soul. This rishi state is not limited by time or place, by sex or race. Vatsyana bodily declared that his rishihood is the common property of the descendants of the sage, of the Aryan, of the non-Aryan, of even the Mleccha. This is the sageship of the Vedas, and constantly we ought to remember this ideal of religion in India, which I wish other nations of the world would also remember and learn, so that there may be less fight and less quarrel. Religion is not in books, nor in theories, nor in dogmas, nor in talking, not even in reasoning. It is being and becoming. Hey, my friend, until each one of you has become a rishi and come face to face with spiritual facts, religious life has not begun for you. Leaders of our societies have never been either generals or kings but rishis. Rishihood does not belong to any age or time or even to sects or caste. Vatsyana says truth must be realized, and we have to remember that you and I and every one of us will be called upon to become rishis, and we must have faith in ourselves. We must become world movers, for everything is in us. We must see religion face to face, experience it, and thus solve our doubts about it. And then standing up in the glorious light of rishihood, each one of us will be a giant, and every word falling from our lips will carry behind it that infinite sanction of security. The Shruti and the clergy. Except our religion, every other religion in the world depends upon the life or lives of some personal founder or founders. Christianity is built upon the life of Jesus Christ, Mohammedanism upon Muhammad, Buddhism upon Buddha, Jainism upon the Jainas, and so on. It naturally follows that there must be in all these religions a good deal of fight about what they call the historical evidences of these great personalities. If at any time the historical evidences about the existence of these personages in ancient times become weak, the whole building of the religion tumbles down and is broken to pieces. We escaped this fate because our religion is not based upon persons but on principles. That you obey your religion is not because it came through the authority of a sage, no, not even of an incarnation. Krishna is not the authority of the Vedas, but the Vedas are the authority of Krishna himself. His glory is that he is the greatest preacher of the Vedas that ever existed. So with the other incarnations, so with all our sages. Our first principle is that all that is necessary for the perfection of man and for attaining unto freedom is there in the Vedas. You cannot find anything new. You cannot go beyond a perfect unity, which is the goal of all knowledge. This has been already reached there, and it is impossible to go beyond the unity. Religious knowledge became complete when Tat Tattvam Asi, that is, thou art that, was discovered, and that was in the Vedas. What remained was the guidance of people from time to time, according to different times and places, according to different circumstances and environments. People had to be guided along the old path, and for this these great teachers came, these great sages. Nothing can bear out more clearly this position than the celebrated saying of Sri Krishna in the Gita. Whenever virtue subsides and irreligion prevails, I create myself for the protection of the good. For the destruction of all immortality, I am coming from time to time. This is the idea in India. Just as our God is an impersonal and yet a personal God, so is our religion a most intensely impersonal one. A religion based upon principles, and yet with an infinite scope for the play of persons. For what religion gives you more incarnations, more prophets and seers, and still waits for infinitely more? The Bhagavata says that incarnations are infinite, leaving ample scope for as many as you like to come. From the very earliest times, our sages have been feeling conscious of this fact that the vast majority of mankind require a personality. They must have a personal God in some form or the other. The very Buddha, who declared against the existence of a personal God, had not died 50 years before his disciples manufactured a personal God out of him. The personal God is necessary, and at the same time we know that instead of and better than vain imagination of a personal God, we have in this world, living and walking in our midst, living gods now and then. These are more worthy of worship than any imaginary gods, any creation of our imagination, that is to say, any idea of God which we can form. Sri Krishna is much greater than any idea of God you or I can have. Buddha is a much higher idea, a more living and idealized idea than the ideal you or I can conceive of in our minds, and therefore it is that they always command the worship of mankind, even to the exclusion of all imaginary deities. This our sages knew, and therefore left it open to all Indian people to worship such great personages, such incarnations. Nay, the greatest of these incarnations goes further. Wherever an extraordinary spiritual power is manifested by external man, know that I am there. It is from me that the manifestation comes. That leaves the door open for the Hindu to worship the incarnation of all the countries in the world. The Hindu can worship any sage and any saint from any country whatsoever. You may take up any one of the prophets or teachers as your guide and the object of your special adoration. You are even allowed to think that he whom you have chosen is the greatest of the prophets, greatest of all the avatars. There is no harm in that, but you must keep to a firm background of eternally true principles. The strange fact here is that the power of our incarnation has been holding good with us only so far as they are illustrations of the principles in the Vedas. Great religious personalities. In every nation's spiritual life, there is a fall as well as a rise. The nation goes down, and everything seems to go to pieces. Then again, it gains strength, rises. A huge wave comes, sometimes a tidal wave. And always on the topmost crest of the wave is a shining soul, the messenger. Creator and created by turns. He is the impetus that makes the wave rise, the nation rise. At the same time, he is created by the same forces which make the wave, acting and interacting by turns. He puts forth his tremendous power upon society, and society makes him what he is. These are the great world thinkers. These are the prophets of the world, the messengers of life, the incarnations of God. Rama and Sita. Rama, the ancient idol of the heroic ages, the embodiment of truth, of morality, the ideal son, the ideal husband, the ideal father, and above all, the ideal king. This Rama has been presented before us by the great sage Valmiki. And what to speak of Sita? You may exhaust the literature of the world that is past, and I may assure you that you will have to exhaust the literature of the world of the future before finding another Sita. Sita is unique. That character was depicted once and for all. There may have been several Ramas perhaps, but never more than one Sita. She is the very type of the true Indian woman, for all the Indian ideals of a perfected woman have grown out of that one life of Sita. Rama was the soul of the old king, but he was a king, and he could not go back on his word. Sita was chastity itself. She would never touch the body of another man except that of a husband. Pure, she is chastity itself, says Rama. Rama gave up his body and joined Sita in the other world. Sita, the pure, the all-suffering. Sita is the name in India for everything that is good, pure and holy. Everything that in woman we call woman. Sita, the patient, all-suffering, ever faithful, ever pure wife. Through all the sufferings she had, there was not one harsh word against Rama. Sita never returned injury. Be Sita. Sri Krishna. He was the most wonderful sannyasin and the most wonderful householder in one. He had the most wonderful amount of rajas, power, and was at the same time living in the midst of the most wonderful renunciation. Krishna can never be understood until you have studied the Gita, for he was the embodiment of his own teaching. Every one of these incarnations came as a living illustration of what they came to preach. Krishna, the preacher of the Gita, was all his life the embodiment of that song celestial. He was the great illustration of non-attachment. He gives up his throne and never cares for it. He, the leader of India, at whose words king came down from their thrones, never wants to be a king. He is the simple Krishna, ever the same Krishna who played with the gopis. Ah, the most marvelous passage of his life, the most difficult to understand, and which none ought to attempt to understand until he has become perfectly chaste and pure. That most marvelous expansion of love, allegorized and expressed in that beautiful play at Vrindavana, which none can understand but he who has become mad with love, drunk deep of the cup of love. Who can understand the throes of love of the gopis, the very ideal of love, love that wants nothing, love that even does not care for heaven, love that does not care for anything in this world or the world to come. They hated every adjective that was applied to Krishna. They did not care to know that he was the Lord of creation. They did not care to know that he was almighty. They did not care to know that he was omnipotent, and so forth. The only thing they understood was that he was infinite love. That was all. The gopis understood Krishna only as the Krishna of Vrindavana. He, the leader of the hosts, the king of kings, to them was the shepherd, and the shepherd forever. I do not want wealth, nor many people, nor do I want learning. No, not even do I want to go to heaven. Let me be born again and again, but Lord, grant me this, that I may have love for Thee, and that for love's sake. A great landmark in the history of religion is here. The ideal of love for love's sake, work for work's sake, duty for duty's sake. And it is for the first time fell from the lips of the greatest of incarnations, Krishna, and for the first time in the history of humanity upon the soil of India. The religions of fear and temptations were gone forever, and in spite of the fear of hell and temptations of enjoyment in heaven, came the grandest of ideals, love for love's sake, duty for duty's sake, work for work's sake. And what a love! I have told you just now that it is very difficult to understand the love of the gopis. A. Forget first the love for gold and name and fame, and for this little trumpery world of ours. Then, only then you will understand the love of the gopis, too holy to be attempted without giving up everything, too sacred to be understood until the soul has become perfectly pure. People with ideas of sex and of money and of fame bubbling up every minute in the heart, daring to criticize and understand the love of the gopis. That is the very essence of the Krishna incarnation. Even the Gita, the great philosophy itself, does not compare with that madness. For in the Gita, the disciple is taught slowly how to walk towards the goal. But here is the madness of enjoyment, the drunkenness of love, where disciples and teachers and teachings and books and all these things have become one. Even the ideas of fear and God and heaven, everything has been thrown away. What remains is the madness of love. It is forgetfulness of everything, and the lover sees nothing in the world except Krishna and Krishna alone. When the face of every being becomes a Krishna, when his own face looks like Krishna, when his own soul has become tinged with the Krishna color, that was the great Krishna. There may be many historical discrepancies. There may be interpolation in the life of Krishna. All these things may be true, but at the same time, there must have been a basis, a foundation for this new and tremendous departure. Taking the life of any other sage or prophet, we find that that prophet is only the evolution of what had gone before him. We find that that prophet is only preaching the ideas that had been scattered about his own country, even in his own times. Great doubts may exist, even as to whether that prophet existed or not. But here, I challenge anyone to show whether these things, these ideals, work for work's sake, love for love's sake, duty for duty's sake, were not original ideas with Krishna. And as such, there must have been someone with whom these ideas originated. They could not have been borrowed from anybody else. They were not floating about in the atmosphere when Krishna was born, but the Lord Krishna was the first preacher of this. His disciple Vyasa took it up and preached it unto mankind. From that ideal lover, we come down to the lower stratum of Krishna, the preacher of the Gita. Than the Gita, no better commentary on the Veda has been written or can be written. The essence of the Shrutis or of the Upanishads is hard to be understood, seeing that there are so many commentators, each one trying to interpret in his own way. Then the Lord himself comes, he who is the inspirer of the Shrutis, to show us the meaning of them, as the preacher of the Gita. And today India wants nothing better. The world wants nothing better than that method of interpretation. One non-dualistic commentator takes up an Upanishad. There are so many dualistic passages, and he twists and tortures them into some meaning and wants to bring them all into a meaning of his own. If a dualistic commentator comes, there are so many non-dualistic texts which he begins to torture, to bring them all around to dualistic meaning. But you find in the Gita, there is no attempt at torturing any one of them. The central figure of the Gita is Krishna. Krishna perhaps has a larger number of followers in India than any other incarnation of God. His followers hold that he was the most perfect of those incarnations. Why? Because they say, look at Buddha and other incarnations. They were only monks, and they had no sympathy for married people. How could they have? But look at Krishna. He was great as a son, as a king, as a father, and all through his life he practiced the marvelous teaching which he preached. He who in the midst of the greatest activity finds the sweetest peace, and in the midst of the greatest calmness is most active, he has known the secret of life. Krishna shows the way how to do this by being non-attached. Do everything but do not get identified with anything. You are the soul, the pure, the free, all the time. You are the witness. Our misery comes not from work but by our getting attached to something. Take for instance money. Money is a great thing to have. Earn it, says Krishna. Struggle hard to get money, but don't get attached to it. So with children, with wife, husband, relatives, fame, everything. You have no need to shun them, only don't get attached. There is only one attachment, and that belongs to the Lord and to none other. Work for them, love them, do good to them, sacrifice hundreds of lives if need be for them, but never be attached. His own life was the exact exemplification of that. Gautama Buddha. A rather sad chapter of India's history comes now. In the Gita, we already hear that distant sound of the conflicts of sects, and the Lord comes in the middle to harmonize them all. He, the great preacher of harmony, the greatest teacher of harmony, Lord Sri Krishna. He says, "In me they are all strung like pearls upon a thread." We already hear the distant sounds, the murmurs of the conflicts, and possibly there was a period of harmony and calmness when it broke out anew, not only on religious grounds, but most possibly on caste grounds. The fight between the two powerful factors in our community, the kings and the priests. And from the topmost crest of the wave that deluged India for nearly 1,000 years, we see another glorious figure, and that was our Gautama Sakyamuni. You all know about his teachings and preachings. We worship him as God incarnate, the greatest, the boldest preacher of morality that the world ever saw, the greatest Karma Yogi, as disciple of himself, as it were. The same Krishna came to show how to make his theories practical. At the time Buddha was born, India was in need of a great spiritual leader, a prophet. There was already a most powerful body of priests. Priests believe that there is a God, but that this God can be approached and known only through them. But while the priests were flourishing, there existed also the poet-prophets called sannyasins. So these poet-prophets of ancient India repudiated the ways of the priest and declared the pure truth. They tried to break the power of the priest, and they succeeded a little. But in 2 generations, their disciples went back to the superstitious, roundabout ways of the priest, became priests themselves. You can get truth only through us. Truth became crystallized again. And again prophets came to break the encrustation and free the truth. And so it went on. Yes, there must be all the time the man, the prophet, or else humanity will die. The priests are the only people fit for the truth. The masses are not fit for it. It must be diluted. Water it down a little. Take the Sermon on the Mount and the Gita. They are simplicity itself. Even the street walker can understand them. How grand! In them you find the truth clearly and simply revealed. But no, the priest would not accept that truth can be found so directly. They speak of 2,000 heavens and 2,000 hells. If people follow their prescriptions, they will go to heaven. If they do not obey the rules, they will go to hell. But the people shall learn the truth. Some are afraid that if the full truth is given to all, it will hurt them. They should not be given the unqualified truth, so they say. But the world is not much better off by compromising truth. What worse can it be than it is already? Bring truth out. If it is real, it will do good. When people protest and propose other methods, they only make apologies for witchcraft. India was full of it in Buddha's days. There were the masses of people, and they were debarred from all knowledge. If just a word of the Vedas entered the ears of a man, terrible punishment was visited upon him. The priest had made a secret of the Vedas that contained the spiritual truths discovered by the ancient Hindus. At last one man could bear it no more. He had the brain, the power, and the heart. A heart as infinite as the broad sky. He felt how the masses were being led by the priest and how the priests were glorifying in their power, and he wanted to do something about it. He did not want any power over anyone, and he wanted to break the mental and spiritual bonds of men. His heart was large. The heart many around us may have, and we also want to help others. But we do not have the brain. We do not know the ways and means by which help can be given. But this man had the brain to discover the means of breaking the bondages of souls. He learnt why men suffer, and he found the way out of suffering. He was a man of accomplishment. He worked everything out. He taught one and all without distinction and made them realize the peace of enlightenment. This was the man, Buddha. He taught the very gist of philosophy of the Vedas to one and all without distinction. He taught it to the world at large because one of his great messages was the quality of man. Men are all equal. No concession there to anybody. Buddha was the great preacher of equality. Every man and woman has the same right to attain spirituality. That was his teaching. The difference between the priest and the other caste he abolished. Even the lowest were entitled to the highest attainments. He opened the door of nirvana to one and all. His doctrine was this: why is there misery in our life? Because we are selfish. We desire things for ourselves. That is why there is misery. What is the way out? The giving up of the self? The self does not exist. The phenomenal world, all this that we perceive, is all that exists. There is nothing called soul underlying the cycle of life and death. There is the stream of thought, one thought following another in succession. Each thought coming into existence and becoming non-existent at the same moment. That is all. There is no thinker of the thought, no soul. The body is changing all the time. So is mind, consciousness. The self, therefore, is a delusion. All selfishness comes of holding on to the self, to this illusory self. If we know the truth that there is no self, then we will be happy and make others happy. This was what Buddha taught, and he did not merely talk. He was ready to give up his own life for the world. He was the only man who was ever ready to give up his own life for animals, to stop a sacrifice. He once said to a king, "If the sacrifice of a lamb helps you to go to heaven, sacrificing a man will help you better. So sacrifice me." The king was astonished. He said, "This animal sacrifice is another superstition. God and soul are the two big superstitions. God is only a superstition invented by the priests. If there is a God, as these Brahmins preach, why is there so many misery in the world? He is just like me, a slave to the law of causation. If he is not bound by the law of causation, then why does he create? Such a God is not at all satisfactory. There is the ruler in heaven that rules the universe according to his own sweet will and leaves us all here to die in misery. He never has the goodness to look at us for a moment. Our whole life is continuous suffering, but this is not sufficient punishment. After death, we must go to places where we have other punishments. Yet we continually perform all kinds of rites and ceremonies to please this creator of the world." Buddha said, "These ceremonials are all wrong. There is but one ideal in the world: destroy all delusions. What is true will remain. As soon as the clouds are gone, the sun will shine. How to kill the self? Become perfectly unselfish, ready to give up your life even for an ant. Work not for any superstition, not to please any god, not to get any reward, but because you are seeking your own release by killing yourself. Worship and prayer and all that, these are all nonsense. You all say, I thank God. But where does He live? Do you not know? And yet you are all going crazy about God? Hindus can give up everything except their God. To deny God is to cut off the very ground from under the feet of devotion. Devotion and God, the Hindus must cling to. Yet the religion of Buddha spread fast. It was because of the marvelous love which, for the first time in the history of humanity, overflowed a large heart and devoted itself to the service not only of all men but of all living things. A love which did not care for anything except to find a way of release from suffering for all beings. Man was loving God and had forgotten all about his brother man. The man who in the name of God can give up his very life can also turn around and kill his brother in the name of God. That was the state of the world. They would sacrifice the sun for the glory of God, would rob nations for the glory of God, would kill thousands of beings for the glory of God, would drench the earth with blood for the glory of God. This was the first time they turned to the other God, man. It is man that is to be loved. It was the first wave of intensive love for all men, the first wave of true unadulterated wisdom, that starting from India, gradually inundated country after country, north, south, east, west. All my life I have been very fond of Buddha. I have more veneration for that character than any other, that boldness, that fearlessness, and that tremendous love. He was born for the good of men. Others may seek God, others may seek truth for themselves. He did not even care to know truth for himself. He sought truth because people were in misery. How to help them, that was his only concern. Throughout his life, he never had a thought for himself. If he was great in life, he was also great in death. He ate food offered to him by a member of a race similar to your American Indians. Hindus do not touch them because they eat everything indiscriminately. He told his disciples, "Do not eat this food, but I cannot refuse it. Go to the man and tell him he has done me one of the greatest services of my life. He has released me from the body." An old man came and sat near him. He had walked miles and miles to see the master, and Buddha taught him. When he found a disciple weeping, he reproved him, saying, "What is this? Is this the result of all my teaching? Let there be no false bondage, no dependence on me, no false glorification of this passing personality. The Buddha is not a person. He is a realization. Work out your own salvation." Even when dying, he would not claim any distinction for himself. I worship him for that. Shankaracharya. There was an element of danger in the teaching of Buddha. It was a reforming religion. In order to bring about the tremendous spiritual change he did, he had to give many negative teachings. But if a religion emphasizes the negative side too much, it is in danger of eventual destruction. Never can a reforming sect survive if it is only reforming. The formative elements alone, the real impulse, that is, the principles, live on and on. After a reform has been brought about, it is the positive side that should be emphasized. After the building is finished, the scaffolding must be taken away. It so happened in India that as time went on, the followers of Buddha emphasized the negative aspect of his teaching too much. and thereby caused the eventual downfall of their religion. I have neither the time nor the inclination to describe to you the hideousness that came in the wake of Buddhism. The most hideous ceremonies, the most horrible, the most obscene books that human hands ever wrote or the human brains ever conceived, the most bestial form that ever passed under the name of religion, have all been the creation of degraded Buddhism. But India has to live, and the Spirit of the Lord descended again. He who declared, "I will come whenever virtue subsides," came again. And this time the manifestation was in the south. And up rose that young Brahmin, of whom it has been declared that at the age of 16 he had completed all his writings. The marvelous boy Shankaracharya arose. The writings of this boy of 16 are the wonders of the modern world, and so was the boy. He wanted to bring back the Indian world to its pristine purity. But think of the amount of the task before him. I have told you a few points about the state of things that existed in India. The Tatars and the Baluchis and all the hideous races of mankind came to India and became Buddhists and assimilated with us and brought their national customs, and the whole of our national life became a huge page of the most horrible and the most bestial customs. That was the inheritance which that boy got from the Buddhists. And from that time to this, the whole work in India is a reconquest of this Buddhistic degradation by the Vedanta. It is still going on. It is not yet finished. Shankara came a great philosopher and showed that the real essence of Buddhism and that of the Vedanta are not very different, but that the disciples did not understand the Master and have degraded themselves, denied the existence of the soul and of God, and have become atheists. That was what Shankara showed, and all the Buddhists began to come back to the old religion. Shankara, with his great intellect, I am afraid, had not as great a heart. I do not know why Shankara should be represented as rather exclusive. I do not find anything in his writing which is exclusive. As in the case of the declaration of the Lord Buddha, this exclusiveness that has been attributed to Shankara's teaching is most possibly not due to his teachings, but to the incapacity of his disciples. Ramanuja. Then came the brilliant Ramanuja. Ramanuja's heart was greater. He felt for the downtrodden. He sympathized with them. He took up the ceremonies, the accretions that had gathered, made them pure so far as they could be, and instituted new ceremonies, new methods of worship for the people who absolutely required them. At the same time, he opened the door to the high spiritual worship from the Brahmin to the Pariah. That was Ramanuja's work. You may mark one characteristic since the time of Ramanuja, the opening of the door of spirituality to everyone. Sri Chaitanya. This one great northern sage, Chaitanya, represented the mad love of the gopis. Himself a Brahmin, born of one of the most rationalistic families of the day, himself a professor of logic, fighting and gaining a word victory. For this he had learned from his childhood as the highest ideal of life. And yet through the mercy of some sage, the whole life of that man became changed. He gave up his fight, his quarrels, his professorship of logic, and became one of the greatest teachers of bhakti the world has ever known, Mad Chaitanya. His bhakti rolled over the whole land of Bengal, bringing solace to everyone. His love knew no bounds. The saint or the sinner, the Hindu or the Mohammedan, the pure or the impure, the prostitute, the street walker, all had a share in his love. All had a share in his mercy. And even to the present day, although greatly degenerated, as everything does become in time, his sect is the refuge of the poor, of the downtrodden, of the outcast, of the weak, of those who have been rejected by all society. Sri Chaitanya was a man of tremendous renunciation and had nothing to do with woman and carnal appetites. But in later times, his disciples admitted women into their order, mixed indiscriminately with them in his name, and made an awful mess of the whole thing. And the ideal of love which the Lord exemplified in his life was perfectly selfless and bereft of any vestige of lust, that sexless love can never be the property of the masses. But the subsequent Vaishnava gurus, instead of laying particular stress first on the aspect of renunciation in the master's life, bestowed all their zeal on preaching and infusing his ideal of love among the masses. And the consequence was that the common people could not grasp and assimilate that high ideal of divine love, and naturally made of it the worst form of love between man and woman. There can be no love so long as there is lust, even a speck of it, as it were, in the heart. None but men of great renunciation, none but mighty giants among men have a right to that love divine. If that highest ideal of love is held out to the masses, it will indirectly tend to stimulate its worldly prototype which dominates the heart of man. For meditating on love to God by thinking of oneself as his wife or beloved, one would very likely be thinking most of the time of one's own wife. Sri Ramakrishna, the one, that is Shankara, had a great head. The other, that is Chaitanya and Ramanuja, a large heart. And the time was ripe for one to be born, the embodiment of both his head and heart. The time was ripe for one to be born who in one body would have the brilliant intellect of Shankara and the wonderfully expansive, infinite heart of Chaitanya. One who would see in every sect the same spirit working, the same God. One who would see God in every being. One whose heart would weep for the poor, for the weak, for the outcast, for the downtrodden, for every one in this world, inside India or outside India, and at the same time whose grand brilliant intellect would conceive of such noble thoughts as would harmonize all conflicting sects, not only in India but outside of India, and bring a marvelous harmony, the universal religion of head and heart, into existence. Such a man was born, and I had the good fortune to sit at his feet for years. The time was ripe. It was necessary that such a man should be born, and he came. And the most wonderful part of it was that his life's work was just near a city which was full of Western thoughts, a city which had run mad after these Occidental ideas, a city which had become more Europeanized than any other city in India. There he lived, without any book learning whatsoever. This great intellect never learnt even to write his own name. But the most brilliant graduates of our university found in him an intellectual giant. He was a strange man, this Sri Ramakrishna Paramhansa. This man came to live near Calcutta, the capital of India, the most important university town in our country, which was sending out skeptics and materialists by hundreds every year. Yet many of these university men, skeptics and agnostics, used to come and listen to him. I heard of this man, and I went to hear him. He looked just like an ordinary man, with nothing remarkable about him. He used the most simple language, and I thought, can this man be a great teacher? Crept near to him and asked him the question which I had been asking others all my life. Do you believe in God, sir? Yes, he replied. Can you prove it, sir? Yes. How? Because I see him just as I see you here, only in a much intenser sense. That impressed me at once. For the first time I found a man who dared to say that he saw God. That religion was a reality, to be felt, to be sensed in an infinitely more intense way than we can sense the world. I began to go to that man day after day, and I actually saw that religion could be given, one touch, one glance can change a whole life. When I myself saw this man, all skepticism was brushed aside. In the presence of my master, I found out that man could be perfect, even in this body. Those lips never cursed anyone, never even criticized anyone. Those eyes were beyond the possibility of seeing evil. That mind had lost the power of thinking evil. He saw nothing but good. That tremendous purity, that tremendous renunciation is the one secret of spirituality. How can great spirituality come without that renunciation? Renunciation is the background of all religious thought wherever it be. And you will always find that as this idea of renunciation lessens, the more will the sense creep into the field of religion, and spirituality will decrease in the same ratio. That man was the embodiment of renunciation. In our country, it is necessary for a man who becomes a sannyasin to give up all worldly wealth and position, and this my master carried out literally. There were many who would have felt themselves blessed if he would only have accepted a present from their hands, who would gladly have given him thousands of rupees if he would have taken them. But these were only men from whom he would turn away. He was a triumphant example, a living realization of the complete conquest of lust and of desire for money. He was beyond all ideas of either. And such men are necessary for this century. We hear in the West about worshipping women, but this is usually for her youth and beauty. This man meant by worshipping woman that to him every woman's face was that of the blissful mother, and nothing but that. I myself have seen this man standing before those women whom society would not touch, and falling at their feet bathed in tears, saying, "Mother, in one form thou art in the street, and in another form thou art the universe. I salute thee, Mother, I salute thee." Think of the blessedness of that life from which all carnality has vanished, which can look upon every woman with that love and reverence, when every woman's face becomes transfigured and only the face of the Divine Mother, the blissful one, the protectress of the human race, shines upon it. Such purity is absolutely necessary if real spirituality is to be attained. The other idea of his life was intense love for others. The first part of my master's life was spent in acquiring spirituality, and the remaining years in distributing it. So men came in crowds to hear him, and he would talk 20 hours in the 24, and that not for one day, but for months and months, until at last the body broke down under the pressure of this tremendous strain. His intense love for mankind would not let him refuse to help even the humblest of the thousands who sought his aid. Gradually there developed a vital throat disorder, and yet he could not be persuaded to refrain from these exertions. As soon as he heard that people were asking to see him, he would insist upon having them admitted and would answer all their questions. When expostulated with it, he replied, "I do not care. I will give up 20,000 such bodies to help one man. It is glorious to help even one man. If I had told you one word of truth, it was his and his alone. And if I had told you many things which were not true, which were not correct, which were not beneficial to the human race, they were all mine, and on me is the responsibility. In order that a nation may rise, it must have a high ideal. Now, that ideal is, of course, the abstract Brahma. But as you all cannot be inspired by an abstract ideal, you must have a personal ideal. You have got that in the person of Sri Ramakrishna. The reason why other personages cannot be our ideal now is that their days are gone. And in order that Vedanta may come to everyone, there must be a person who is in sympathy with the present generation. This is fulfilled in Sri Ramakrishna. So now you should place him before everyone. Whether one accepts him as a sadhu or an avatara does not matter. God, though everywhere, can be known to us in and through human character. No character was ever so perfect as Ramakrishna, and that should be the center round which we ought to rally, at the same time allowing everybody to regard him in his own light, either as God, Savior, teacher, model, or a great man, just as he pleases. In a narrow society, there is depth and intensity of spirituality. The narrow stream is very rapid. In a Catholic society, along with the breadth of vision, we find a proportionate loss in depth and intensity. But the life of Sri Ramakrishna upsets all records of history. It is a remarkable phenomena that in Sri Ramakrishna there has been an assemblage of ideas deeper than the sea and vaster than the skies. We must interpret the Vedas in the light of the experience of Sri Ramakrishna. As in the olden times, it was the Lord alone, the deliverer of the Gita, who partially harmonized these apparently conflicting statements, so with a view to completely settling this dispute, immensely magnified in the process of time. He himself has come as Sri Ramakrishna. Therefore, no one can truly understand the Vedas and Vedantas unless one studies them in the light of the utterances of Sri Ramakrishna, who first exemplified in his life and taught that these scriptural statements, which appear to the cursory view as contradictory, are meant for different grades of aspirants and are arranged in the order of evolution. If there is anything which Sri Ramakrishna has urged us to give up as carefully as lust and wealth, it is the limiting of the infinitude of God by circumscribing it within narrow bounds. Such a unique personality, such a synthesis of the utmost of jnana, yoga, bhakti, and karma has never before appeared among mankind. The life of Sri Ramakrishna proves that the greatest breadth, the highest Catholicity, and the utmost intensity can exist side by side in the same individual, and that society can also be constructed like that, for society is nothing but an aggregate of individuals. He is the true disciple and follower of Sri Ramakrishna, whose character is perfect and all-sided like this. The formation of such a perfect character is the ideal of this age, and everyone should strive for that alone. So now the great conclusion is that Ramakrishna has no peer. Nowhere else in this world exists that unprecedented perfection, that wonderful kindness for all that does not stop to justify itself, that intense sympathy for man in bondage. Without studying Ramakrishna Paramhansa first, one can never understand the real import of the Vedas, the Vedanta of the Bhagavata and the other Puranas. His life is a searchlight of infinite power thrown upon the whole mass of Indian religious thoughts. He was the living commentary to the Vedas and to their aim. He had lived in one life the whole cycle of the national religious existence in India. Ramakrishna Paramhansa is the latest and the most perfect, the concentrated embodiment of knowledge, love, renunciation, Catholicity, and the desire to serve mankind. So where is anyone to compare with him? He must have been born in vain who cannot appreciate him. My supreme good fortune is that I am his servant through life after life. A single word of his is to me far weightier than the Vedas and the Vedanta. Oh, I am the servant of the servants of his servant. But narrow bigotry militates against his principles, and this makes me cross. Rather let his name be drowned in oblivion and his teachings bear fruit instead. Why? Was he a slave to fame? From the day Sri Ramakrishna was born, dates the growth of modern India and of the Golden Age. In the Ramakrishna incarnation, there is knowledge, devotion, and love. Infinite knowledge, infinite love, infinite work, infinite compassion for all beings. You have not yet been able to understand him. What the whole Hindu race has thought in ages, he lived in one life. His life is the living commentary to the Vedas of all nations. India has suffered long. The religion eternal has suffered long. But the Lord is merciful. Once more, He has come to help His children. Once more, the opportunity is given to rise to fallen India. India can only rise by sitting at the feet of Sri Ramakrishna. His life and his teachings are to be spread far and wide, are to be made to penetrate every pore of Hindu society. Who will do it? Who are to take up the flag of Ramakrishna and march for the salvation of the world? Who are to stem the tide of degeneration at the sacrifice of name and fame, wealth and enjoyment, nay, of every hope of this or other worlds? Glory unto him on whom falls the Lord's choice. Ramakrishna Paramhansa came for the good of the world. Call him a man, or God, or an incarnation, just as you please. Accept him each in your own light. He who will bow before him will be converted into purest gold that very moment. Go with his message from door to door, if you can, my boy, and all your disquietude will be at an end. We must electrify society, electrify the world. Idle gossip and barren ceremonials won't do. A huge spiritual tidal wave is coming. He who is low shall become noble, and he who is ignorant shall become the teacher of great scholars. Through his grace, arise, awake, and stop not till the goal is reached. Life is ever expanding. Contraction is death. The self-seeking man who is looking after his personal comforts and leading a lazy life, there is no room for him even in hell. He alone is a child of Sri Ramakrishna, who is moved to pity for all creatures and exerts himself for them even at the risk of incurring personal damnation. Others are vulgar people. Whoever at this great spiritual juncture will stand up with a courageous heart and go on spreading for door to door, from village to village, his message is alone, my brother, and a son of his. This is the test. He who is Ramakrishna's child does not seek his personal good. They wish to do good to others, even when at the point of death. All that I am, all that the world itself will someday be, is owing to my master, Sri Ramakrishna.
End of chapter 9. My India, the India Eternal by Swami Vivekananda. This is a Vivekananda Kendra Kanyakumari recording. All recordings of Vivekananda Kendra are in the public domain. For more information and also to volunteer, please visit www.vkendra.org.